Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. It's great to be here with all of you. I think we're very privileged today to have our speaker, Dr.Shobi Ahmed, with us. So I'm going to introduce him. He's the co-founder and CEO of Therapeutics. He's a physician scientist who's received his MD, PhD at Yale and Harvard. He's worked as a pediatrician and at various biotech companies in R&D and clinic and scientific operations. And today he'll be talking to us about the age of precision neuropsychiatry. And so with that, I'm gonna hand it off to Shobi.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you everyone for attending on this Friday afternoon. What exactly is the age of precision psychiatry? And why is it so exciting? And what is Samba Therapeutics' role in this? That's some of the topics that I want to cover today. Now, when we think of precision medicine, there are some fields that are more well characterized, such as precision oncology or cardiology, but precision neuropsychiatry is less well known. And in part, that's because the overall complexity of the brain means that imbalances in functioning, produce so many infinite variations in symptoms that a clinician might observe. This diagram right here just is one way of parcellating all of the functions, that we rely on our brain to process. And if any of these, inputs and outputs, so to speak, or network brain circuits start malfunctioning for whatever reason, you have potentially a syndrome or a disorder or some disruption in a dimension of normal function. Now, because we lack knowledge of the underlying neurobiology of these physiological states, i.e. quantitative biomarkers, which guide treatment and staging and even stratification in most other fields of medicine, psychiatrists, mental health providers, neuropsychologists tend to rely on subjective observation of behavior and patient self-reports. And, those can be hard to keep track of. They are hard to quantify. There's a measurement problem there. There's been at least 3 or 4 decades of effort within the field to try to derive more quantitative and less subjective biomarkers. And another reason why neuropsychiatry is so crucial is because mental disorders also magnify the risk of multiple other chronic conditions, including heart disease. So the brain-body connection is also underappreciated. And I'll refer to that in a term called interoception, the sensation of your viscera and how it informs your mood and your cognitive function. Just as ominous is the possibility that exposure to the wrong treatment over time can change the brain, damage the brain, and make what could have been a successful intervention less successful later on. And, the episodes or the severity could just get more frequent and worse. And beyond personal challenges, these disorders significantly impact loved ones, caregivers. The burden on society is tremendous. And finally, close to my heart, pediatric and adolescent mental disorders are unfortunately on the rise. In the last few decades, and especially with the COVID pandemic, there's been a huge uptick in adolescent suicidality, early bipolar disorder diagnoses, and the neurodevelopmental trajectories of neuropsychiatric disease often begin before birth and during birth and in infancy. So as a result, if left undiagnosed or insufficiently treated, it really robs individuals of the opportunity to live productive and satisfying lives. So the challenge is to ease the burden. There are more than 1 billion people suffering worldwide. It's estimated, 1 in 10 people will have a mental disorder at some point in their life, even if they recover fully. And during the COVID pandemic, the estimates range from 25 to 30%, depending on the region and how you're measuring. And the annual cost of the world economy is in the trillions. These are rough numbers, so they tend to range, but one projection is that the global burden will be $15 trillion by 2030. So what do we have to work with at present? We have the DSM and the ICD diagnostic criteria. And as this punchy title indicates, there's 636,120 ways to get a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. And the reason why this is so multivariate is because, number one, these consensus criteria have been evolving over time in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which guides treatment and clinical management. And also, there's been a certain ad hoc gerrymandering of different diagnoses. There's internal turf wars sometimes, and pharmaceutical companies often have a stake in what is reimbursable and things like that. So there are both the scientific issues of only having clinical symptoms and observation and self-report to rely on, and then there are the associated social and legal and economic aspects. So because there are so many ways to receive this diagnosis, treatment selection is overwhelming to patients and even clinicians. People will often go based on convenience or what they're used to rather than evidence-based or real-world guided treatments. And having knowledge of the factors that like the environment, the very particular experience and neuroimaging perhaps, or genomics of that individual is rarely part of the clinical workflow. So there are some US federal initiatives to try to change this, including the National Institute of Mental Health initiative called RDoC, the Research Domain Criteria. And this is an attempt to identify domains that are transdiagnostic and are also linked to neurobiology at the level of cells and circuits and physiology, and also are tracked during a person's lifetime. So there's a lot of cohort studies and international consortia that have specialized in this, and there's a lot of great research in the spirit of open science. And Sama Therapeutics is definitely benefiting from all of the amazing machine learning toolboxes or data sets that are available for public analysis that are out there. There's another initiative I should mention, which is the BRAIN initiative during the Obama administration, and the Human Connectome project. But before the focus turned to the brain, these sorts of initiatives were happening in cardiology or oncology with a lot of funding and a lot of pharmaceutical company investment as well. You might have heard of the Framingham Heart Study, which was very instrumental to taking cardiology into a more quantitative discipline. The HiTOP is yet another dimensional attempt to classify neuropsychiatric disorders. As you can see, it's really complex. The higher order dimensions, including the general factor of pathology. There's genetic studies that try to delineate an underlying genetic architecture for neuropsychiatric disease predisposition. And if you have this so-called general factor of psychopathology, you may, depending on your environment and your, even diet and other stressors in your life, you may go down many different pathways. And this is an attempt to group disorders by a different kind of dimensional logic as opposed to a observational or diagnostic logic. And it definitely has some merit, and it's part of the toolbox of many emerging precision psychiatry initiatives, both in academia and industry. So, these transdiagnostic spectra, which conceptualize psychopathology along these different dimensions in order to improve reliability and validity, in some parts making research more rigorous and replicable, because if we don't have a shared point of reference for meta-analyses, it's hard to make progress as a whole. So to pivot to precision cardiology for a moment, which is a real success story, just 75 years ago, there were not many observable or measurable aspects of heart function. And now we have CT, MRI, fluoroscopy, perfusion, scintigraphy, echocardiography, PET scans, all that. And there is a lot to be learned, I think, for precision neuropsychiatry by looking at the clinical translational steps that occurred in other fields like oncology and cardiology. So the need for large cohort-based clinical trials, using real-world data such as hospital repositories, with the associated privacy concerns, environmental data such as measuring things that may affect that particular constellation of symptoms and diseases, slowly building up the knowledge base and sharing it. There's a lot of siloed knowledge out there, especially within academia and industry. There tend to be perverse incentives, scopes of grants, defensiveness around intellectual property that limit the speed of advance for the whole field. And, we're really trying to, have a spirit of intellectual generosity about that while maintaining a viable business model, which is what, startups are unfortunately or fortunately have to do. So biobanks, there's a large population biobank called the UK Biobank, which have also been using, and it's been instrumental. Like tens of thousands of publications across all different fields of medicine have come out of this. So it's a great example of, for young people who are interested in doing research and creating new techniques and statistical and machine learning analyses, that there's big data out there. There's more analyses than you could ever think of doing. So dive in. And, the ability to use, very high dimensional models and dimensionality reduction and clustering approaches that withstand scientific rigor and don't have spurious correlations or artifacts, and all of the fun things about scientific research, having your years of effort get debunked, for example, all part of the game. And the great thing is, if you are collaborating in a spirit of intellectual generosity, as I said, you don't really feel as affected by this. So going back to the brain, what are some of the measurement scales that show a lot of promise? I would say that single cell recording tends to be difficult in human beings. They tend to happen more in rat or dog or monkey models, especially microelectrode arrays. And ECOG is where some human research can be done during the course of neurosurgery. Oftentimes, it can be done in order to make sure that the surgeon doesn't remove any part of the body any part of the brain that is useful for function. And then EEG, we're doing a lot of EEG research. There's a number of large data sets that we've been harmonizing and analyzing and correlating with cognitive and affective and interoceptive domains. And that's a big part of our focus right now. fMRI, for us, the scale or the depth varies. The temporal resolution also varies. Spatial resolution, the risk, all of these have to be taken into account when designing a study or trying to chart a clinical and scientific strategy for a startup. The best example I can think of in psychiatry, actually, that has shown very high treatment effects in terms of, using a precision approach, yielding 30% greater efficacy, for example, is actually in transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's more well established than a lot of pharmacological approaches, but we're trying to build on that for other drug interventions. So as the diagram shows, rather than a one-size-fits-all psychiatry, we need a stratified psychiatry where people can be matched to the ideal intervention or combination of interventions that are best for them. There are, for example, ways to do TMS with ketamine, which is a rapid antidepressant. And we're actually studying how best to, synergize between those interventions. And, the comparison, like a head-to-head comparison with standard of care is often the best way to establish a new treatment, because placebo has a certain limitations in neuropsychiatry, more than other fields, because the expectancy effects that you get with mood disorders tend to also create nocebo effects. So if somebody is like in a psychedelic clinical trial and they think they're in the placebo arm, and it's not hard to tell if you know what psychedelics are like in terms of the state of altered consciousness they create. So being able to design head-to-head trials or dose-dependent methodologies seems to be one way to proceed in neuropsychiatry as opposed to, say, oncology. And Professor Martin Arnst in the Netherlands is actually the person who coined the term stratified psychiatry, and he actually created an amazing 2-decade clinical data set with EEG for a range of psychiatric disorders in his clinic called the Brain Clinics. And, he's been a great advisor. Now, the difficulty with, neuropsychiatric diagnosis can be illustrated with pediatric bipolar disorder. When I was in training, it was an ongoing discussion about whether there was such a thing as pediatric bipolar disorder, as opposed to just a moody and defiant child. Is the definition of, or the description of mania really that different to a child acting out? And actually, as a result of this debate, one resolution was to create a new category of, disorders that sort of are differentiated from bipolar disorder, classically speaking, and that is called DMDD, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And the definition is a childhood condition of extreme irritability, anger, and frequent intense temper outbursts. So when I was rotating on, for example, a pediatric inpatient ward, we would put such kids on lithium under the diagnosis that they had bipolar disorder. But, I think thankfully, actually, there's less of the defaulting to psychopharmacology and more of a behavioral intervention that is occurring, especially with family therapy and other approaches. So it just goes to show how a label, derived from a description that may be culturally relative and age dependent can lead to a large number of patients getting a drug that they should not have gotten, and may actually lead to lifelong sequelae that we may not be aware of. So the importance of being able to track at a more fine-grained level the underlying neurobiological changes and trying to base treatment pathways on such biomarkers as opposed to a constellation of symptoms which may overlap and be redundant in many cases and have a lot of within category heterogeneity makes this point obvious. When we can talk about bipolar disorder, one way of separating out all of the factors that go into such a mysterious diagnosis, more than others, not that depression and schizophrenia and anxiety disorders aren't difficult to parse out. But I think bipolar, by its very name, suggests that there is a continuum of the psychosis and affective disorder states in which bipolar is difficult to place with any accuracy or certainty. It tends to run in families. It often has subclinical at-risk states that are extended. One hope is that we can derive biomarkers for at-risk states before people transition, whether it be in bipolar or schizophrenia, which also overlaps with bipolar. The range of sleep and other cognitive issues that tend to lead to bipolar are also hard to parse out. The comorbidity with, major depression or generalized anxiety tends to be very high. And that's, often something you see across most mood disorders. Even something like Alzheimer's comes with a very high comorbidity of depressive symptoms. And finally, the environmental risk factors, which may or may not be modifiable, depending on the, home environment and the economic and social circumstances. And then the response to stressful events. The resilience or the ability for the same individual to undergo similar levels of stress as another, and while only one is affected or falls into a pattern of escalating mood disorder, is also one of the mysteries that requires a quantitative neuropsychiatry, with just symptoms and qualitative descriptions of what people underwent. If we don't have a biosignature or subtype of some kind, we cannot really predict who will develop a more severe form of depression, who will get panic attacks, for example, and who will just shrug it off seemingly and go on with their lives. So being able to create both quantitative measurement and also probing for this kind of risk factor is something that precision psychiatry as a field is very focused on right now. And here, to continue on the topic of bipolar disorder, it's a great example. And by the way, these colorful pictures are very common in precision medicine. We love to show how many ways you can have green people and red people and the cross hatching you can get. But it makes for great illustrations. So the standard treatment relies on the DSM and ICD criteria, the clinical symptoms, and the core specifiers. A slightly more nuanced staging model would add in things that can be readily measured, such as cognitive tests, working memory, executive function, cognitive control, like the Stroop test, and there's a large list of this, and there's also a niche of the biotech industry that creates such tests. It's like playing a Sudoku puzzle, for example, on the computer, and it can often track neurodegenerative disease or other neurodevelopmental conditions. So being able to measure functional cognition is important, but the next level would be to risk stratify by genomics, omics, other omics, and neuroimaging. And that's because within each stage of severity, there is an additional layer or two of people that have not gotten there in the same way, right? So it's the concept of multi-finality or equifinality, which is very well known in conduct disorder and ADHD. There's multiple ways to start and end up in the same place and vice versa. And this is something that often leads to clinical trials not meeting their endpoints or demonstrating the necessary efficacy and safety to be approved. And, to get really fine-grained in bipolar disorder, this is a voltage-gated calcium channel, which has been linked to bipolar disorder. And here's a dendrogram that gives you an idea of how many polymorphisms exist of this gene that encodes this, and how it can lead to a certain predisposition. But that's just the beginning, because the amount of data that is generated from sequencing and the number of models that can be built, and then adding subsequent layers of network models, cells, networks, behavior, and then finally clinical trials. This is a years, if not decades long process. And it begins perhaps with a laboratory discovery at the level of cells and proteins. Another example is integrating neuroimaging with functional assessment, say, of sleep. And this also requires a lot of very careful observation over time and, consortia efforts. And in this case, we find that the default mode network, which is a core circuit in the brain that, has a certain consensus definition, it can be hyper or hypoactive in certain patients with depression, and a stimulatory regimen through transcranial magnetic stimulation can actually alter the firing rate of that circuit, so to speak, and correct the behavior. One issue is that you often need a lot of treatments. You need to go in almost every day sometimes, and there are trials that have run comparisons between getting TMS every day for a few hours versus getting it every week for a longer time. And all of this, research has to be done in order to derive a new standard of care. Right now, there's a certain amount of trial and error, and but there's a lot of effort to try to get to the underlying circuits that can be modulated, and measuring, where to stimulate and how to stimulate. If you go to a TMS clinic now, there's a method of convenience, so to speak, called the BEAM-F3 method. And studies out of Harvard, Stanford, and Brown have shown that if you use a imaging modality to find the peak anti-correlation between the dorsolateral PFC and the anterior cingulate cortex, you actually get up to 30% better response. So it's a great proof of concept for the need to do more measurement in psychiatry as a whole. Within our own team, we have Irina Ornatsky-Butte. She is actually an Australian researcher. She published a paper on how spatial transcriptomics can bridge multi-omics and neuroimaging. The basic concept here is that you take imaging-derived phenotypes from MRI and correlate them to transcription gradients in brain atlases. There's maybe 6 individuals in Seattle who got sequenced postmortem. So it obviously suggests a limitation of this approach, because that small sample that cannot account for the wide variation in gene transcription patterns across the individual patient. But it's a great example of how we're only beginning to build up the complexity needed for these sorts of analyses, building brain network models, and figuring out how neurotransmitter densities and distribution of these circuits that are actually responsive to particular receptor targets can be modulated and mapped beforehand, and then potentially allow for better consideration of drugs that may or may not work in that patient, and potentially a biosignature in time that can be part of a billing code or a reimbursable pathway. And that has happened in so many different fields already, like cardiology. If you meet a certain threshold on cardiac enzyme tests, you classify as having had an MI or a subclinical MI and things like that. But in neuropsychiatry, we really don't have that quantitative supplement to people's self-description and others' observation of what is going on. So Sama Therapeutics is focused on accelerating drug and device development, discovering fundamental neuroscience, delivering patient clinical decision support. And normally those would seem like they were 3 different companies worth of intellectual property, but it points to the kind of integration that we're engaged in. Our core IP is neuroscience, machine learning, and we're agnostic as to the modality or the measurement technique. And by integrating across imaging, omics, psychometrics, physiological data, even natural language processing data, we're trying to derive techniques that can guide a lot of different markets, from pharma R&D to bedside patient care to academic discovery. I had to boil it down to our executive summary. Our vision, our long-term vision is to outperform the DSM. I'd say that might be on the scale of 10 to 20 years, depending on the challenges of that. We have a distinctive team. I call it a co-op corp that bridges currently siloed academic and industry disciplines ranging from neuropharmacology to psychometrics, clinical patient care to payer provider infrastructure. We're responding to an enormous unmet medical need because millions of patients with neuropsychiatric disease do not benefit from current treatments, and incidence has multiplied since the pandemic. We're pursuing a de-risked software as medical device strategy. There's an accelerated 510(k) pathway, it's called, for white label neurotechnology solutions, followed by a de novo pathway for clinical decision support workflows. We are relying on innovation synergies, many of which I've mentioned, such as open science and federated AI learning across these different techniques and historical data from prior drug and device approvals and practice guidelines and expert consensus. And here we partner with psychiatrists, neuropsychologists, and others that are at the forefront of patient care and responding to their needs and what actually makes sense. Because one issue that has come up in many precision medicine focused R&D divisions is that you may come up with a really cool, mathematically appealing way of measuring something, but if it can't be integrated into a clinical workflow, if it's not portable, then it really won't catch on. It'll just remain as a kind of vanity project. So being able to translate a very abstract, deep learning kind of approach to the hustle and bustle of a private practice where a patient may not want an EEG headset on their head, even if it looks like a really cool bicycle helmet, then we won't be able to get any data to help that patient. So, needless to say, there is an enormous amount of investment for these analytical tools that can help at the patient provider point of care and differentiate these heterogeneous disorders. Our approach relies on strategically considered AI and machine learning patents, trade secrets, and publications. And as a public benefit corporation, Sama pledges 10% of our founders' shares to nonprofits focused on research and access for underserved minority and refugee populations. And that's our ethical mission. So this is our early team, myself, Dr. Crystal Carrington, Dr. Adam Safran, Dr. Arina Arnaskirute, Dr. Tyler Moore, and Dr. Ilyas. musculitis. Also, Dr. Adam Teed, who wasn't on this early slide, but I really have to mention him because he's done a lot of great research on the brain-body connection and interoception. He also helped me with this presentation. So thank you, and I will open it to questions.
Thank you, Shobi. So I think one question that we got on the while you were presenting was, how can one compete with the DSM? Would it make sense to systematically develop AI tools for the DSM codes?
That's a great question. I think that the initial phase of precision psychiatry will no doubt be used in conjunction with the existing DSM billing pathways. Just adding a little more guidance for edge cases. For example, if you don't know, in major depression, oftentimes there's a large subset of patients that respond to an antipsychotic medication. And the current treatment pathway might put them on SSRI and wait until they fail before they get the drug that they actually need, right? So we wouldn't necessarily be changing the DSM diagnoses or the treatment pathway, but we'd be able to measure underlying neurobiology and be able to put the patient on a drug sooner than they otherwise would.
I think I was on mute. No, that's very helpful. I'm just going to wait for a little bit longer to see if there's any more questions. If not, then I think we can probably adjourn. But and I'm just kind of looking through to see if there are any more questions.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so there's no more questions at this time. So I think we'll adjourn this session. Hopefully everyone who's watching today got a really good sense for an introduction to precision neuropsychiatry. I know there's a lot we covered here today, and I think it's really helpful to really understand this and really as people and as the industry evolves, and I'm sure if there's any more questions that come up, we can feel free to reach out to us, and we can definitely form that connection and then maybe even get back to you. There is one question that I see that just popped up, so maybe I can try to see if I can answer that question, or we can get that question answered.
Sure.
So Shobi, you discussed the importance of using publicly sourced data. What's the process like for assessing methodological integrity, balancing varied methodologies, and limiting unintentional data bias?
So it requires, statisticians that are experienced with big data and have, an awareness of both the theoretical considerations and are also willing to use competing methodologies to ground truth, to get at the ground truth and stress test different ways of doing it, right? So like we're doing this every day at SAMA. There's a tool called AutoML. It automatically runs a number of hybrid and ensemble models on any kind of tabular data, but it often is subject to overfitting, which is a way of saying that if you have too many features that you're throwing at something, the more you throw, the more something is likely to stick, even if it doesn't actually measure what you're trying to measure. So being able to run a script manually to kind of double check and then, devise clever tests such as age binning or, classification by sex, gender, in order to see whether intuitively, if you expect something to change and it doesn't change in the direction that you do based on the modification you made to your statistical tests, then you have to dig deeper.
Okay, got it. I think with that, what I'm gonna just say is like Dr. Shobi, Ahmed's email address is here, And so maybe we can, if you have any further questions, you can feel free to reach out to him.
Right, and I'm also, open to anyone from the National Youth Science Camp, any young college students and otherwise that are looking for internship opportunities or to learn more about the field, please reach out.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, well, thank you everyone for your time today, and have a wonderful weekend.